you get to that, I'm really, really keen. There's a lot of things I want to pick your brains about, Victor, but I suppose, arguably, you're best known for athletics and baseball, but your hero was Muhammad Ali, right? So you sort of were grounded in boxing from an early age.
Yes, my dad was one of seven brothers, and most of them boxed in the military, some in the Navy, some in the Army. And so when I was 13, I guess, my dad took me to the very first Muhammad Ali Sonny Liston, or I should say Cassius Clay Sonny Liston fight. And actually, I had been watching boxing with my dad since he was since the 1960 Olympics when Cassius Clay was a light heavyweight. So I watched him win the gold medal, and I really somehow identified with this brash, more and four and predicting the taunting people and all the stuff that he did. And my dad did not like him. He thought he had a loud mouth. And so I'd be cheering for, Cassius Clay, and he's cheering for Sonny Liston to shut his mouth. And then after he beat him twice, of course, this was, I became an even bigger fan. And by the time I was 15, 16, if you remember the fight in your part of the world against Henry Cooper in 1966, and he bloodied up his face. And then thereafter, they came out with a life-size poster that I talked my parents into buying for me that I put on the back of my bedroom door that said, "I'm so fast that by the time I turn off the light switch, I'm in bed before the light goes off." And I just always identified with this, and in his book, The Greatest, and all the rest of it. And another really just wonderful part of this whole story is I met him a couple times. Once when I was with the Tower of Power and we were staying there for like 5 weeks at the Sheraton there on in New York near Times Square, and he pulled up in the front in a limousine, and I guess they were coming from his New Jersey home over there, and I saw him get out of the car and walk down the street, and I ran down and ran up to him, and this guy, big tall guy, like 6'9" guy, tried to step in to stop me from talking to him, and then the guy Muhammad said, "No, no, no, let him be, let him be." And I said, "I'm a huge fan, and I'd like to get your autograph." And so he said, "Do you have any pen and paper?" And I'm digging through my coat, and I pull out, and I've got a envelope with 2 or 3 buds of marijuana in it. So I just hand him the envelope and the pen, and he starts trying to write, and he's poking holes in the envelope. And he said, "Is this the good shit or what?" So, and then to go full circle, recently at the event in Los Angeles, where I had two fighters, the Saudi comes to America, the Turkey takeover in LA there, and I had Terence Crawford and also Rio Venezuela that both won that night. After the fight, and we were looking to get a limousine back to the hotel, and this lady walks up to me. She's got like a Muslim hat on and a Muslim dress on, and apparently she recognized me because she followed boxing, and she just said, "Victor, I want to give you a hug and take a picture with you." She said, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, I was Muhammad Ali's wife and the mother of his first 4 children."
Oh wow, wow.
So
Yeah,
that
that
was an
is full
interesting
circle.
connection.
You mentioned Tower of Power, and I don't know how keen you are to talk about the old days, but it's very interesting that you obviously got an athletics scholarship. I know you're a long jumper and a sprinter. Back when we were talking about yard dashes as well instead of 100 meters and 200 meters.
That's right. I'm so old that in fact it's not only 100 yards compared to the 100 meters now and 400 versus 440, but we ran on clay. It was on dirt. So they didn't have Mondo tracks then. And if you remember in 1968, now that's the year I graduated from high school, and then in 69 and 70, I went to college. Well, at our home stadium, they used to have a meet called the West Coast Relays. And do you remember in 68 when Tommy Smith and John Carlos got on the medal stand and black powered the fist.
Yeah, of
Well,
course.
shortly thereafter, John Carlos came to our home stadium, and I was actually in a relay, and we won a belt buckle. They didn't give trophies or medals, but they gave you a West Coast Relays belt buckle, and I still have it. I won a belt buckle in that meet, but John Carlos set the world record in the 100 meters at 9.1.
Hey, do you still have the envelope with Ali's signature on it?
No, I don't know what happened to this. I certainly wish I did have it, but
It's
but I
it's
don't.
it's long gone like the weed.
Well, it's yeah. I don't. I mean, I saved it for a long time, but we're talking. This is like 1977, so 87, 97. It's just like almost 50 years ago.
Sure, sure. Obviously, athletics into a band. It's a very checkered background before becoming what you've become. Obviously, in terms of the knowledge you've acquired over the years, how do you go from athlete to guitarist to shall I say, I don't know, one of the brains of performance enhancing drugs in the world?
Well, I was a musician from the time I was 15 until 33 is when I retired. And I had made 17 albums that are still available online that you can listen to, and played with a number of different famous groups, including Tower Power and the jazz pianist Herbie Hancock. And then because I had three daughters, and it just at a certain point became unfair for me to kiss them and say, well, I'll see you in 6 months. I'm going on a world tour, and I realized I had to find another source of income to be able to take care of my kids. And so once you live that life and no matter how much money you make, I don't care if you're Beyonce, I don't care if you're the Beatles, uh, the way they book the tours is they're about 150 to 200 miles apart. So you might start in San Diego and then play Los Angeles and then play Bakersfield and then play, Fresno and then play San Francisco. And same thing, you go to the East Coast and when I met Muhammad Ali that first time, we actually were there for 34 days and we played 31 different gigs, most of them colleges right there around New York. So it's just it got to a point where I needed to find something else that could provide me with an income to support my family. And a guy that had graduated from USC and got his master's degree together with one of my cousins, he knew that I was an athlete, and he'd started this laboratory, and he was doing what they called multi-element analysis. It was an instrument called an ICP that could simultaneously analyze many elements, more than 30 elements, in a time frame of about 2.5 minutes. And what that did is it enabled you at a low cost to collect a large amount of data. So they've called it Victor's knack, and when they write about this, they just mean that somehow whatever it is that I decide to do, I can go straight to the top. So I'm the first athlete that I worked with was Alberto Salazar in 1985, and his coach was Bill Dillinger, who was the U.S. track coach at the '84 Olympics in Los Angeles. And then the second athlete I worked with was Matt Biondi, who at that time was the world's fastest swimmer, 1,500-meter world record holder. And so I did blood testing, excuse me, and provided supplements to 25 athletes. And we went to Seoul, Korea. I was there at the finish line when Ben Johnson ran 9:79, and 48 hours later, all hell broke loose. But that group, I'd actually had a party at my backyard. I have a very big backyard. And about 6, 7 of these athletes, this is even in the Netflix film as well, and it was called Send Off to Seoul Party. And then we went to Korea, and my group, which we called the Balco Olympians, won 15 medals. Well, that's the total medal count was 97. So that means that 18% of the medals that the U.S. won in all sports were Balco Olympians.
It's it's
So,
it's worth adding here, Victor, that this was all clean by this point, wasn't it, as well?
oh,
It
this
wasn't.
was all clean. But let me say, in that context, I was all clean and Balco was all clean from '84 all the way until 2000. Now, does that mean that some of these shot putters and other guys that I was working with, I did not get directly involved with any of their use of anabolic steroids. But as you might imagine, to be competitive at that level, they had no choice but to use the steroids. So did I have knowledge of this? Yes, but I wasn't directly involved in it in any way, shape, or form. And that didn't happen where I took the trip down the slippery slope until the end of 1999 and the beginning of 2000, when I started with Bill Romanowski and Marion Jones and a group of track athletes that I traveled to Sydney, Australia for the 2000 Olympics. And of course, as you know, Marion Jones won 5 medals there.
Yeah, but so just before we get to that, Victor, there were a couple of things I wanted to ask you, boxing related. And obviously, the first one, I've got no idea if you know the details on this, but the 1984 games, I believe there were a lot of US positives that weren't made public. Do you believe that was only track and field to save some of the huge names in the track and field night in the LA games of 84? Do you think that was possibly across the board and possibly even boxing?
Well, I actually have a lot of knowledge about that. And what people don't realize, and I won't name his name, but the guy that actually built the Olympic Analytical Testing Laboratory in Los Angeles, the near UCLA. Now, Don Catlin was the head, the politician that was basically in charge. But the guy who built the lab, once they got commissioned in 1982 to build the laboratory to do all the testing in '88, he went on record, and they had at the beginning, there were something like 9 positives, or I think it was 16 positives at the beginning. And then during the second half, and they had like 9 more positives, but they claimed that somebody broke into the lab and like stole the results, and the results couldn't come out, if you remember. So this guy spoke out publicly against this. Now, the reason I tell you this is this same guy, and this is what's crazy about the Jeff Novitzky investigation and all the rest of it that went down. This guy, he was there from 1982 until 1997, okay? And then he quit. And then because Don Catlin was just, there were so many things that he believed they should do, such as establish a test for norbolethone, which was a drug that Patrick Arnold created, was the first species of the clear, and it was originally made by Merck Laboratories in the 60s. And this gentleman told Don Catlin, you need to make a test for this because somebody's going to make this stuff and it's going to be everywhere. And in my book manuscript that never came out because Shane Mosley sued me in a complete fraudulent lawsuit, he said basically, blow it out your a-hole because we're not going to do a test for that. Well, as it turned out, right about that same time, Patrick developed this, or he saw it in the Merck Index, and he made a gallon of this stuff. Tris, it was all over the NFL. It was all over track and field. It was into the Canadian. It was into MMA. It was everywhere. So Don Catlin didn't figure this out until way later, like 2002. So long story short, the guy that had worked at that lab and built that lab was on the payroll of Balco Laboratories as one of my consultants. So I knew everything they were doing in that lab. So if you have that knowledge, right? And there was all kinds of things, the what they call the office boy who was scribing the meetings. This got out to a coach who got out to an athlete that got back to me, and he came to me and he said, well, is this clear stuff? Does it have anything to do with Trenbolone, or is it a modified Trenbolone derivative? Or I said, oh my God, how do they know this? Because, that's exactly what it was. It was, and part of it did contain Trenbolone. So what I'm trying to tell you is I had information not only directly coming from the UCLA Olympic Testing Laboratory, but also a member on the board of directors of the International Amateur Athletic Federation, the governing body for track and field. So there's corruption is what I'm trying to tell you from top to bottom. So yes, there were many, many positive drug tests, including, I believe, the original 9 and 16 more later that included, I know, a shot putter and some others, I was told, but they all got covered up because they just said somebody broke into the lab and they couldn't print the results. They'd lost all the data.
So we know that was from the US team, but we don't know if it was exclusively track and field, right?
I think it was track and field mainly, but at the same time, they had swimming. There could have been other events. What I heard was it was track and field, predominantly track and field athletes, but the second bunch were completely covered up. The first ones, it just and the reason we can go into detail if you'd like about this now, but I know a lot about corruption within the United States system. So not only was it, you know, Russia and China and Kenya and Jamaica and other places where I believe there was corruption, the United States was also covering up positive drug tests that I have direct knowledge of.
Sure. I mean, yeah, I've done some due diligence and read some books on this, and I've found it all fascinating. And so skip to 1988 and the Olympics you mentioned in Seoul with Ben Johnson. You know, we know how dirty that 100-meter race was historically now with the people that were involved and the amount of positives that came from that, whether or not it was from that race, but the people, the personnel that was in that race. Where do you think boxing was in 1988? Because there was the WBC were doing some testing, there was some commission testing, but it it wasn't as stringent, and people still say, and it was incorrect. I've subsequently found out, but that the first test was Franz Botha and Axel Schultz in that fight. That wasn't the case, but
Well, what year was that?
early 90s.
Yeah, my understanding is that Flip Homansky is the one that introduced anabolic steroid testing in urine in 1992 with the Nevada Commission.
Yeah, so I mean, where I'm coming from is we know that athletics were that dirty in 1988. Where do you think boxing was? And when you think of the heavyweight division and some of the characters that were in there.
I think it was rampant. I really do. I think there was, once again, anybody that's ever used anabolic steroids or testosterone, or they know that the benefits, it makes you so much stronger and so much faster, and therefore so much more dangerous. And in a sport like boxing, where it's all about bodily harm, I mean, we don't know because there was no testing, but my sense is that it all started, the steroid use, as you know, in athletics in the 50s. Now, do you know the story about John Ziegler and Diana Ball and all that?
So I've read a bit of it, but I mean, I'm happy for you to tell me. And obviously, I
Well,
know that
okay.
cycling was big as well in the 30s and 40s
Cycling
as well, right?
became big in the 60s, but it started in the 50s. And the Eastern Bloc, Czechoslovakia, Russia, etc., were just dominating the U.S. weightlifters. He was the medical doctor for the U.S. weightlifting team. And he went to a pharmaceutical company and asked them to create an anabolic steroid so he could give it to the U.S. team so that they could be competitive with the Eastern European weightlifters. So he was actually giving the drugs to the weightlifter. John Ziegler and Siba Geigy is the one that made it. If you look this up, look up Diana Ball in the history, and you'll see that what I'm telling you is true. So let's go a little bit beyond that after the 88 Olympics, and yes, I believe that I don't like to use the word everybody because, and I've used it in the past, and I probably shouldn't have done that. Now I use the overwhelming majority. So I think in that 100-meter final, if there were 8 or 9 guys, all but one, I think, have basically admitted that they were using some sort of performance enhancing substance leading up to the 88 Olympics. And the same with others. And I also, without giving you the specifics, because, and I've said this online, you can find it before, but I was told by a very high ranking US Olympic official from the world of track and field that there was not just one positive, Ben Johnson, in Seoul in 1988, but there were 4 positives. And 3 of those were from the United States, and 2 of those were the highest profile female athletes that were on the front cover of Time magazine. Okay. And you know who I'm talking about, Flojo and Jackie Joyner. And the third one was Andre Phillips, who beat Edwin Moses in the 400-meter hurdles. And of course, Edwin had won like 110 races in a row. He was totally dominant. Here comes this little Andre Phillips. Now, let's link that to today. All 3 of those athletes were coached by who? Bob Kersey. Well, Bob Kersey's training Sidney McLaughlin, who just set the world record in the 400-meter hurdles at this most recent season and in the Olympics. So Dennis Mitchell, who was in that race, is still coaching. Let me give you an interesting statistics. In the women's 100-meter final that made the U.S. team for the just recent Paris Olympics, all three, first, second, and third place, were coached by Dennis Mitchell, who tested positive himself and was involved in other steroid scandals involving Justin Gatlin. So these John Smith and Bob Kersey and Dennis Mitchell, this is my opinion, okay, that these guys who I believe were involved in providing anabolic steroids and other performance-enhancing substances to their athletes, they're able to circumvent the testing today, and this still goes on with the current crop of athletes.
So I was going to get to circumvention a little bit later, but what lured you to the dark side in 99, 2000? What was because you were having all that success at your end. maybe the athletes might have been taking stuff, but you hadn't gone down that route yourself. So why the slippery slope, as you mentioned earlier?
Okay, so I met with the chemist Patrick Arnold at the Mr. Olympia in Las Vegas in December of 1999. And he knew that I was working with all these world-class athletes. And he said, I have some stuff, is what he called it. And he said, it seems to help with recovery. And he had a little 100cc white bottle with an eyedropper, and which I bought. I think the first bottle was for $150 that would last for a very long time. And he just said, you take a few drops and you put it under your tongue. So I tried it myself, and it seemed to be effective, but I wanted to do a little bit more research on it. So I had the ability, because Balco was a clinical laboratory, to submit samples to Quest Diagnostics there in Las Vegas and do an entire anabolic steroid panel, including the TE ratio. So I took it 4 days in a row, and I collected urine samples. And my numbers came back like 100, 50, 25, 0. So that told me that this substance had an affinity for the androgen receptor. And it was likely some sort of I didn't know what, but designer type steroid. And the bottle said, Nor stuff. Well, that was the first species. And what he meant by Nor stuff was, I learned later, norbolethone stuff. This is the Merck Index. He found it at the Merck Index, and he made a gallon of this stuff. Thereafter, he made the second generation of the clear, and that was the tetrahydrogestrinone, the THG, which was completely undetectable. And it took them a long time to figure this out. So knowing that I had a substance that was not illegal and it was undetectable, and it seemed to work with me, and I started giving it to people like Bill Romanowski and others at the beginning of 2000, and then it continued that I gave it to other athletes, including Marion Jones. But that was kind of the gateway, was having this. And then once I'd made that decision to go down the slippery slope, because I realized when you get to the very elite level of sport, that they have a use or lose mentality. And these drugs are so strong. In 100 meters, let's say, they're more effective and powerful for women than they are for men, because men have 10 times the amount of testosterone in their system. So I would say that it makes a female sprinter 4 to 5 meters faster in 100 meters, and a male 2 to 3 meters faster. So when you're at that Olympic final level, 2 or 3 meters difference is just, you couldn't begin to make a final unless you were doing something. And the thing that people don't understand is that you have a carryover effect, meaning that when they actually use the drugs for an Olympic, let's just take the 2008 Olympics, where the Jamaicans broke all the world records and won all the gold medals and kind of emerged on the scene. back in the October, November, December timeframe, that's when not just the Jamaicans, but in Olympic athletes in general, that's when they're using the drugs in conjunction with explosive power and speed training, and they convert all this muscle tissue to type 2B fast twitch. And those gains carry over for months and months, if not years. So they're not using it during the competitive season, they're using it during the off season. And then the interesting thing that I discovered about this was that I went back, and this is on a BBC or CBC, the Canadian Broadcast Communication special they did in 2008 with me, is that they showed the statistics for USADA, and they showed the statistics for the IAAF. And the first quarter, the second quarter, and the third quarter, USADA did 1,200 tests. In the fourth quarter, when the fish were biting, and that's the time to throw your hook and line in the water to catch the fish, they only did 600 tests. Now, why would USADA be reducing the number of tests to only 50% during a time frame that we know that the athletes are using drugs?
Hey, so Victor, on
Would you
that
like
slip,
the answer?
yeah,
Because
sorry,
they
go on.
don't want to catch athletes.
Sorry,
The system is designed, it's designed to enable, harbor, and promote the use of performance enhancing drugs.
because they want the stars to be stars, right?
Of course, of course. Let me just go back and before you move on, you asked another question that I didn't get to answer, and that was how I went from music to medicine. And there was an article that came out in the San Francisco newspaper in 1988, and it was called Getting Athletes in Tune. And there were four 300-pound shot putters and discus throwers and hammer throwers holding me on top of their head with me pointing with a number one finger. And the opening line was, talk about a career switch. How does this guy go from music to medicine? And then they interviewed a bunch of the athletes and coaches. And of course, I went to Seoul, and they called me a minister without portfolio.
Where did you? So, but by the way, just while we just touched upon that slippery slope, would at what point did your conscience start to kick in? Were you thinking this isn't right the entire time, or were you thinking, well, we're all doing it now?
Well, I knew that it was wrong. If it's, it's, I said way back in 2004, it's not cheating if everyone's doing it. I was parroting Charlie Francis, who also said things like, so show me somebody not on steroids and I'll show you the loser and all the rest of the stuff. But now I say that the overwhelming majority were doing stuff. And once you get that knowledge, and you realize that above and beyond that everybody or the overwhelming majority of these athletes are using stuff, it's that from the very top, meaning, and let me take just a moment to explain something to you about this, the top program. These are the 14 companies that fund the Olympic Games that put in, over $1 billion, or it's 100 million plus each, which the total is over $1 billion. They're the ones that actually demanded that WADA be founded in 1999 for the 2000 Olympics, because their logos, their company logos, were being tarnished by all of these positive drug tests. So they wanted to get this under control and basically create a system that was fairly easy to circumvent.
So you must have had an incredible thirst for knowledge from the early 80s all the way through to today, in the sense that obviously learning the spectrometer and the ICP test and everything else, everything that's come along, and obviously your own creations, the cream and the clear and the other things that you've played such a big role in. You must have just learned everything from the ground up, right?
Well, you're right. I basically, in a big feature that they did on me in Sports Illustrated, the head of the human performance laboratory at the Mayo Clinic said that I was an autodidact, meaning I'm self-taught. So I had the ability in the beginning I met a doctor who, out of the yellow pages, to help me had the license and helped me found Balco. He took me to Stanford University, which is where he went to school. and he helped me get a library card at the Lane Medical Library. And this was back in 1984, where I had a IBM clone computer that was a I repeat, megabyte hard drive, and you had a scratchy, phone connection. But he taught me how to reach into the National Library of Medicine, and I would program things like zinc and muscle strength and magnesium and muscle cramps and copper and connective tissue ligaments and tendon. And then I would go to Stanford 60, 70 hours a week and crawl around on my hands and knees and copy all these scientific journals and read them. So after a period of time, I became very specialized in terms of collecting data on world-class athletes. And right away, by the mid-90s, I had 250 NFL players in the database, thanks to Bill Romanowski. So I had all this data, and I realized that intense training, most of the science came from the Department of Military Medicine. And a famous researcher named Anita Singh was the first one to publish that strenuous exercise causes in sweat loss a deficiency of zinc, which suppresses the soldier's immune system. So then I started realizing, the SEAL trainees and the Rangers and all these special ops type of military personnel, they do, as an example, a test on their urine on a train day. And we're talking about all physiological and psychological stressors. So it would be underwater demolition, hand-to-hand combat, verbal abuse, freezing cold temperature, all these different factors, and the effect that the training had on the bodily losses of minerals and trace elements. And you would find significant losses from the intense training, which led me to understand that these minerals and trace elements are needed in an adequate supply for the hormones and enzymes in the body to function properly. So all I was doing was correcting these depletions and deficiencies initially, and this seemed to have an amazing effect upon performance and specifically recovery.
Was that right? There was a spike in performance with these minerals, and they did actually legitimately cause that.
Yes, and of course, originally the first research that came out was in 1985, where they found out that chronic kidney failure patients that they basically were low in zinc, and when they gave them zinc supplements at 50 milligrams, their testosterone levels increased by 85%. Later in 1996, Ananda Prasad did a study where they took elderly men, but healthy, and they gave them zinc at 30 milligrams, the same dosage that's in my product ZMA, and in a period of 3 months, it doubled their testosterone levels. Now, what people will say is, if you're low and you correct that depletion in zinc, then it will replete your body stores of these hormones. But if you're not low, that it won't have a significant effect. And that may be true. But we do know with athletes that train strenuously, we do see immune suppression, we do see zinc depletions and deficiencies, and we do see increases in performance when you correct those.
Let me just fast forward a little bit. I do want to go back, but fast forwarding. Why do you think Vada? Why are you such an advocate for Vada ahead of all the other places? And we know now that there's drug-free sport. We've got UCAD over here. There's USADA and WADA. Why are you an advocate for Vada? And is it down to the carbon isotope ratio testing?
That's a part of it. That's a part of it. And that idea originally came from me. And it was before Vada was ever formed. Dick Pound, the founding chairman of WADA, reached out to me and they flew me to New York, and I met with him for 3.5 hours. And that was one of the things that I told to him. And it took a number of years, but in 2013, he actually came out with a set of recommendations in terms of the testing. And that was to increase the amount of carbon isotope ratio testing, or now called IRMS testing. And based on this simple fact, Tris, all of the other tests that are conducted in anti-doping have about a 1% positive rate. the CIR has more than a 5% positive rate. So if you've got a test that's 5 times more effective than others, why would you not use it? The typical answer is because it's expensive. So the primary reason in the beginning that the reason that I believe that Vada is better than the others is because, one, they test for all prohibited substances at all times. And they include the carbon isotope ratio testing, which I believe synthetic testosterone is the biggest barn door that's wide open, and how they're flying under the radar and circumventing this. But they test for this, where WADA, they have in and out of competition testing, and then UCAD follows them. And that means that what the panel of tests that they do on fight night is way different than what they do during training camp. And specifically during training camp, they do not test for any of the stimulants or narcotics. Now, if you're in a sport like boxing where you want to cut weight and you can take phentermine like Oscar Valdez did, that's the #1 weight loss product prescribed by doctors in the world. Now, why would you enable boxers and other athletes to use phentermine and amphetamines and all these other stimulants, which we know do enhance performance? Them saying they don't, they're just simply lying. They know that they do. And narcotics, which enable you to continue to train because they remove the pain, which is that's really bad too. So there's many other. I could go into the specifics of, and here's what's something that will show you how clearly that WADA and UCAD and USADA and everybody else that follows the WADA code. And by the way, I met with Rich Young, one of the co-authors of the WADA code, okay? And he's praised me publicly for all the information that I gave to him. But WADA, in 2015, they changed the rule. And it used to be that you could have two missed tests, and the third one was considered a positive in 18 months. So imagine it's a speeding ticket on your driving record, right? So you can have 2, but you can't get another ticket before 18 months because now it's going to be you're going to lose your license or you're going to get a positive test. So this went on from when all the way from 1990 until 2015 had been in place. January of 2015, they changed the rule to that you could have 2 missed tests, but a third one would be a positive in 12 months, which made it easier to circumvent the program because you could get 2 missed tests, say at month 3 and month 6. Well, all you got to do is just stay off for 6 months instead of a year, and now you can take another missed test. So it's like American baseball and strikes. Strike 1, strike 2, you're still up to bat. So why would they change a rule to make it easier to circumvent the testing? I ask you that question. Because they lack a genuine desire to catch the athletes who are cheating.
Wow. Yeah, I think so. Let me ask you this then. In other sports, participants are allowed to take on board things like, just in inverted commas, Gatorade or Lucasade and stuff like this. Do you think boxers should be allowed to take on anything other than water during a fight? Would it help fighters with their health and help dehydration and that kind of stuff, or do you think this is a can of worms? Because we talk about dehydration, we talk about brain injuries and different things, which I wanted to get to, but is there scope for something for the rules to change so that fighters could have something different to just water in the corner, electrolytes, or maybe not an energy drink, but you know what I mean?
They should absolutely be able to use these electrolyte type of products. Let me explain what happens, okay? There's research that shows that when you're running, you lose about a gallon of water in an hour. But if you're playing a sport like football or boxing, where you're moving different directions, it's explosive, it's a more power and speed type, you lose triple that amount. So we know that these boxers are are in a training session, they easily lose 5, 6 pounds. Okay. So how do you counteract that? The two most important things are sodium and carbohydrate. So you sodium load and your carbohydrate load. So imagine that your body is a balloon and it's got little holes in it, the skin's in the pores in your skin, and these act as like little pieces of chewing gum that block these. So that's basically what you're doing is taking sodium and carbohydrates to help you with water retention. So as the rounds go on, if you don't do this, as the rounds go on, imagine you're on 405 freeway in Los Angeles. And as the rounds go on in the fight and you become more dehydrated and you go from 4 lanes to 3 lanes to 2 lanes to gridlock. So the performance at the end is nowhere near what it is in the beginning of a fight because of dehydration, unless you take these steps to help them maintain a higher level of hydration throughout the fight.
Wow, that's good. And I mean, I know you said overwhelming majority on other things, but how prevalent do you think PEDs are in boxing today?
My guess is 60%.
Okay. And by the way, when was your first time in the gym? I mean, we obviously talked about Ali and different things like that and the other sports. What was your first time in a boxing gym? Do you recall that? And was it working? Was it a Balco related um bit of
The
business you were
first,
doing?
okay, the first time I actually was working in a gym, the first boxer, everybody knows that at a distance that I worked with Shane Mosley in 2003, and he was subpoenaed. But that was really, I met him one time and showed him how to do some stuff, and of course he misrepresented the facts and sued me for $12 million. And of course, it turned out that it was voluntarily dismissed because my attorney just put on a table, here's a copy of your grand jury transcript where you admitted that you knowingly used EPO, and here's your lawsuit here with a declaration that you were duped and somebody told you that you were taking vitamins when they were giving you something else. Which time did you lie? And of course, he wouldn't admit that he lied to the Balco grand jury. So of course, the lawsuit was dismissed. So we won't count Shane Mosley. Thereafter, I did the very first fighter I worked with was in 2009, and that was with Andre Ward. And when he fought Edison Miranda, in, I believe, July of 2009. Then I helped him again in September, I believe it was, might have been November of 2009, when he won the title against Mikkel Kessler. The next fighter was Nonito Donaire. And that was there was a gym called Undisputed Gym. It still exists. It's at a different location. But it was a kind of an interesting meeting. I was at a Wells Fargo bank, and the manager knew me, and I guess Nonito banked at the same bank. And when I pulled up, I saw this van that said Filipino Flash on the outside. And so the manager of the bank came up and he said, you're in sports, and I know a guy here that's in sports. Let me introduce you to Nonito Donaire. So we talked briefly at the bank, and we agreed to meet the next day. And so I went to the Undisputed Boxing Gym and his entire team. There was Mike Basil and his wife, Rachel, and Nonito and Brian Swartz, who owned the gym. And we had a meeting, and we agreed to work together. And so I got him a code, and the next day he went and got his blood tested, and I put together a supplementation program for him. And I brought in Remy Korchemny, who's now a 92-year-old coach that is just phenomenal. He got his PhD in explosive speed and power in the late 60s and was an Olympic coach in the 70s. But anyway, I brought Remy in, and we had a very successful 8-fight run. And if you remember in 2012, Nonito won the Boxing Writer Association Fighter of the Year award, 4 fights, 4 wins, and over Juan Manuel Marquez, who had knocked out Manny Pacquiao. So I had a very successful run with him. And then Virgil Hunter, who has a gym over the bay, together with Andre Ward, he started referring elite boxers to me. And the next thing you know, I decided to build my own training facility right down the street, on the exact same street, opposite side, 0.4 of a mile down the road. I built this training facility that we have here at SNAC.
Nonito
And
was a bit. Yeah, go on.
let me conclude by saying the cherry on the top. Since 2010 until now, over the last 14 years, we have trained and we have done blood testing and provided supplementation programs for 31 world champions.
Wow. So Nonito was a bit of a pioneer, wasn't he, in the sense that he was one of the guys that really forced the issue, right?
Absolutely. He was the very first one who ever did 24/7, 365 testing. Now, I clearly understood even back then that to be effective, it has to be year round. So the first two fighters that in Vada that ever did 24/7, 365 was Nonito and Edwin Rodriguez. Actually, when he fought Andre Ward later, I sponsored both of them at a fee of $20,000 a piece to try to help get this concept going. Thereafter, it's been very difficult. And now fighters will negotiate each individual fight, whether there's 4 weeks or 8 weeks or 12 weeks of testing before the fight. Yes, that's helpful, but at the same time, you have the model that was created by Floyd Mayweather of fighting in September and fighting in May. And then the question is, if they do 8 weeks of testing before a fight, what are they doing the other 4 or 5 months? Yeah. When the barn door is wide open, they can use all the drugs they want. You can taper off testosterone, a week before you go into the testing pool. And like I said before, these gains that are made with months and months of using drugs, and then you taper off before you enter the pool, those gains carry over to fight night.
Can you beat all the tests out there now? Can you circumvent them?
Can I beat the tests?
Yeah.
Let me tell you, I would never attempt to do that ever. I have way too much going on in a positive sense for my life. So would I say that it is possible? And do I believe there are people that are doing it, circumventing the testing? Are you talking specifically Vada?
No, just anything. I was saying, I suppose, do you have the knowledge to beat anything?
Let me say this. Everybody thought when Balco was in existence that it was just what's the next designer? What's the next undetectable? What the dopers are always going to stay one step ahead of the testers. That's not how it goes at all. Ever since Balco, there has not been one single designer steroid that anybody's heard of in the last 20 years. Can you name one?
No, I can't. But I suppose, but are there people working on things that are behind the scenes? And could there be someone that's got something that you don't know about?
Well, there's something that they can't do. I'll give you one right now. IGF-1 long R3, insulin-like growth factor long R3. They have the original form, but it's not effective because it only stays in the system for an hour. The long form stays in the system for 10 hours. They have no test for this. So are there drugs that there are other things like thyroid drugs that they use? Well, when you're microdosing, and let me explain what they are doing. They're not doing designer stuff. And here's the reason so people understand this. Vada changed the entire world of anti-doping. And here's how. It used to be that for an anabolic steroid, there were 2 prongs. The first prong was, and all anabolic steroids are similar in structure to testosterone. The second prong was there had to be scientific evidence that proved that it promoted muscle growth or protein synthesis. When THG or the clear came and they realized there was no science whatsoever, they changed the rule and they removed the second prong. Thereafter, all it had to be was similar in structure to testosterone. They tweak a methyl for an ethyl group. They make some little modification. You have what they call a mass spectrogram fragmentation pattern, and it's got these peaks. And if there are certain peaks that match, they don't even need to know the name of the drug or what it is. They've never seen it before, but it's a positive. So what happened since then? What are athletes doing now? Let me tell you exactly what they're doing. They went old school, meaning they're doing endogenous hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, insulin, EPO. Okay, so these are 4 very powerful drugs. So they fly under the radar. And let me tell you exactly how they do it. So say that you've got the initial TE ratio of 4-to-1, right? And normal is 1-to-1. And you even have genetic variation there because Asians are 0.76 in one study, whites were 1.1, blacks were 1.3. So, but they're on average, they're 1-to-1. So you could do something like, do you know what a troche is? You ever heard of a troche? Troche? These were used, it came out during the biogenesis and A-Rod scandal. And these clinics in Florida and other places, they make little lifesavers. And sometimes they're square and sometimes they're round. Exactly. They look just like a lifesaver. Okay. Would you like cinnamon? Would you like grape? Would you like raspberry? Whatever flavor you would like. They contain 75 milligrams of testosterone. About 10% of that gets absorbed, 7 milligrams, right? So if you're naturally, your body's producing 50 milligrams a week or 7 milligrams a day, and you can be up to 28 milligrams, which is the 4-to-1, you can take one troche, two troches a day, spread this out, increase your circulating testosterone level from 7 to 14 to 21, and you're still flying under the 4-to-1 TE ratio.
So,
Now,
yeah, go on.
that's one example of
Yeah.
flying under the radar. The growth hormone test is pathetic. Okay, it does not work. They can't catch anybody beyond 24, at most 36 hours. It's not a good test at all. And if let me give you an example of that. The last time that USADA caught anybody using growth hormone, and there has been one test, and that was in 2015. So for the last 9 years, you haven't had a single positive growth hormone test? Now, let's talk about EPO. Since 2018 until 2024, so we're talking 6 years, there have been a grand total of all athletes, Olympic athletes, 3 positive tests. Does anybody believe that? So what they're doing is they're microdosing to stay under the threshold of the allowable limit, and they do it at night. And there are smart people. Vada's very smart. And how I know this is my fighters, as an example, when Demetrius Andrade fought Benavidez, they were there at 10:30 at night. They were there at 6:30 in the morning, right? So
Right.
they understand when this is going on.
Yeah.
And so, there's many reasons. And the other thing that's really important is, and one of the shortcomings of Vada is, what I'm constantly pushing for, is that fighters need to go into a pool of 24/7, 365. Now, I have talked with Margaret, and she has agreed that a fighter can join Vada and enroll and do 24/7, 365 testing for $15,000 a year. Now, each test that they do of all prohibited substances costs about $2,500. So now that means, by deduction, and of course it's random and they control it however they control it, but that means on average that they could be tested randomly about 6 times a year. Well, that is a huge deterrent if you know that the testers could show up at any moment. Okay. So people are not doing this. If you notice, just look online today, and I had a talk with him about this, that if they have the rematch between Devin Haney and Ryan Garcia, because of all the controversy there, Devin has offered publicly to enroll in testing, of which he would pay the entire fee, $40,000 for 20,000 each, to be in a testing pool from now until the planned rematch, which would be sometime about 6 months away. Now, we'll see if Ryan Garcia wants to step up and do the testing or not. And if the answer is no, then why not? So I'm glad to see that fighters are beginning to understand you need to have more than just a 8-week or 10-week period of testing pool before a fight, because that is called announced testing. They know that the day they sign, that's the day that the tester can come the following day.
Sure.
So, making sense?
Yeah, of
So
course.
there's still issues. Vada is by far the if you want to call it gold standard, it's the best that's available to boxers at this time, but there are still ways to circumvent. There are still, I don't like this idea of being able to use drugs for 6 months and then do 2 months worth of testing and before a fight, because you can really gain a competitive advantage by using all the drugs you like for months and months.
So with the mention of microdosing and thresholds, when we hear, oh, he's got a trace element of this in his body, or it was a marginal, it was a fractional amount, not enough to change your performance. Is that any kind of argument at all, or is it a
No,
case
no,
of
it's complete and total BS. Okay. And if you notice in the Ryan case, what they said was, it appears that somebody spiked these products. And crazy that both products that they submitted both contained ostarine. And then they deducted, the scientists, that the amount that was in his system didn't match with the amount that was in the drink, because he claimed that he took it right after the weigh-in to rehydrate, and then they collected a sample that day and the next day, and all of a sudden he's consuming this amount, and then they find a different amount that doesn't add up in his urine sample. So I think there was some what do you want to call it there? Devious, fraudulent type of activity, in my opinion.
so in terms of in terms of that threshold and microdosing thing, it doesn't matter if there's trace elements or whatever. You think that if there's a smoking gun, then it's still a gun.
Okay, so here's what happens, and there's evidence of this that appeared with John Jones, the UFC fighter, and why he had negative test, negative test, negative test, then positive test, then negative test. How do you have this? Doesn't make sense. How could I test? Ryan Garcia's argument was, how did I test negative for 5 tests, and then all of a sudden I test positive twice in a row? I'll tell you exactly how that happens. You want to know? When he's testing during the training camp, he is fully hydrated. When you push out 15 pounds of water and you've got these trace amounts that get lodged in the adipose or fat tissue in the body, these can get released. Okay, so there's how and why he tested positive. Now, what I went back and tracked was the following. He was tested by Vada, whatever the date was, when he fought Tank Davis. Then he fought the other guy in Texas, I forget his name,
Oscar Duarte,
but no testing whatsoever. So all the way from the time when he fought Tank until he fought Devin, many, many, many months, whatever that adds up to, no testing until he entered the pool. So he could have used ostarine for 8 months, right? And then you go off, and then all these drugs have a taper time. Whatever it may be, the detection capabilities are getting better and their limits are lower and lower, and they're catching more people, I have to admit. But basically, it's more likely, in my opinion, that he had been doing stuff and then he pushed this out by pushing out 15 pounds of water trying to make the 140 weight cut.
Sure. You said, by the way, about being able to work in boxing and the lack of barriers for entry. You said that on the Netflix doc. Are you not allowed in other sports, or are you still allowed to be involved across the board?
Well, there's nobody that's not allowing me to do anything. Do I think that I'm a lightning bolt no matter what I say or do or wherever I go? And because I talk about corruption, about what I learned in Major League Baseball and what I learned in the NFL, and why they have the rules that they have. And I'll just give you a quick example about the NFL. So I call this guy, and because I was working with the Oakland Raiders before the Super Bowl in whatever year it was, 2002, 2003, and the lineman, we had about 3 or 4 of these guys that weighed 350 pounds plus, and I wanted to check with the NFL to make sure that the adipose P or the phentermine, which was legal or being prescribed by doctors, if they were testing for that, because it's also a PED and it's also on the list, right? And so I talked directly to the head of the entire program for the NFL, and I looked at their program, and it said certain stimulants I said, certain stimulants, and there was a list of 10. And then I realized now they have like 61 stimulants, but back then it was like 42. So I said, well, I'm confused here because on the Olympic list, there's 42, and on your list is 10. Does that mean, Doc, that these football players can take any one of these other 22 that they like, including phentermine? And he said, what I'm going to tell you is we only test for these 10 stimulants. Okay, Doc, I get it. Here's where the other 22 is where the barn door is wide open. So
Wow.
they know darn good and well what the program is and how to circumvent it, and that positive drug tests are bad for business. And so it's all about cash. It's all about those that receive the majority of the financial gain from any sport lack a genuine desire in catching athletes using drugs. So I believe they enable, harbor, and promote the use of PEDs with this activity.
The ethics of taking PEDs in boxing is different to any other sport, I suppose, apart from MMA, in the sense that, and we touched upon it in our messages yesterday about CTE and inflicting harm and damage. It's not just trying to jump faster, jump further, run faster, and be stronger. The damage that you can inflict by being artificially stronger, it's a whole other argument morally, isn't it?
Well, that's why I'm so passionate about the sport of boxing, and why I realized that the knowledge that I had gained in Olympic sport and professional sport could be applied to boxing. And then there was no testing. And then smart people, like Margaret Goodman and Flip Homansky, but what they saw is that others, including, I met with USADA twice, including Rich Young, who was a co-author of the World Anti-Doping Code that exists today, and Dick Pound, and this was all very public. And then they came and said, well, if Wada and USADA are attempting to learn from this guy so that they can improve the testing, well, maybe we should reach out to him, which they did. And it all started with, if you remember back in the day when Margaret wrote a column for Ring Magazine called The Fight Doctor, and she contacted a reporter named Steve Kim, who had a tenure at ESPN. He's worked in a number of other places. But so he made the introduction, and I did that first interview for the Fight Doctor column in Ring Magazine. And then we agreed to meet a couple times, and they basically wanted to ask me, different things about and learn how that these athletes were circumventing the testing, and what it would take to put together a program that would be more effective. And basically what I did is made some calls to people like Dick Pound and introduced Margaret to him. And he told her what needed to be done to be able to do Olympic caliber testing. And Vada was born.
Should athletes be allowed to take marijuana?
Marijuana is like alcohol to me. They shouldn't smoke marijuana and go in the ring. No. I don't. Do I believe it's performance enhancing? No. I think it should be considered like alcohol.
Why do you have beef with Memo Heredia?
Because I believe that Memo Heredia continues to this day to provide PEDs in the world of boxing, and it's very dangerous. And there's all sorts of things that, let me put it this way. Because I've been such a high-profile anti-doping advocate since 2005, there are people now that were on the dark side. And of course, I was on the dark side for 4 years. And of course, that was 21 years ago. But they have come to me and said, we want to be on the side of justice like you are. We don't want to be on the dark side. And we see that you can be successful using other training methods and so on. So they come to me with information, and they come to me with actual drugs that they have received from people. And these somehow make it into the Smyrtle lab to be tested so we can figure out what people are doing. So I know athletes that have worked with Memo that have later come and worked with me, and then they tell me exactly and precisely what they're doing with Memo, including things that he's done that's put people in the hospital. So he's a dangerous character, in my opinion. So this is why I continue to try to expose him and his activities, and knowing that he has the expertise to fly under the radar. There's many, many drugs. And let me say this, there are also powerful substances, one of which is the most common weight loss product that people buy out there in the fitness world, L-carnitine, and they use this in a very concentrated injectable form. It first came out with Mo Farah there in your neighborhood that won double gold in 2012 and 2016, where he admitted that he was injecting L-carnitine. So there are other things like concentrated sesame seed oil in an injectable form that increases aerobic capacity. So are there other things that are not being tested for that may in fact be legal, but they're available in either eyedropper or pill or oral form to the general market, but they get them in a more concentrated form and they inject them. So yeah, there's, I don't know if I would call it a beef, people, if they understand what he did, that he is the ultimate definition of a rat, okay? That he was supplying all these athletes, Marion Jones and many others, with drugs. And then he went in, when they were looking for him, he went into hiding for many years. And then when they finally found him, he came and testified in open court in San Francisco, in a federal court. And he gave text messages, emails, voice messages, Western Union receipts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He ratted out these 10 athletes and Trevor Graham, the coach, and then he got a get out of jail free card. When he was the guy at the top of the food chain that when they parted company, he was mad. The dispute was because they owed him $30,000 in drug money. So this guy was the top of the chain, and Jeff Nowitzki used him to get Trevor Graham for lying to a federal agent, which meant he said he didn't know Memo, and Memo produced a picture of Trevor at his house during the Christmas vacation of 1996. So is the coach more at fault or is the supplier more at fault? Why do they get the supplier to get the coach, but let the supplier get out of jail free card? So Memo really never got any consequence for the many years that we know. He's even admitted to all this publicly. You've probably seen some of the videos that he brags about it all the time. So do I think that we need to keep a watchful eye on him? And there's enormous suspicion on my part there. Yes. At the same time, are there people who should be suspicious of me because of things that I did when I stepped over the line 21 years ago? I can understand that. But if people take a look at what I've been doing for the last 21 years, they would realize that I have become more successful than ever. I have a lot to lose. There's no evidence that I've ever done anything on the dark side since then. And that's really all I can say about it.
We talked about Ali at the start. Do you was he taking performance enhancers to get through the Berbick fight, anti-aging stuff and things like that? Did you know anything about that?
I don't think he was taking steroids, but I do know somebody that worked with him back in the day. And there were some things, different types of medications that mainly for that it wasn't steroids, but other sorts of things that he was taking. And of course, there was no testing then.
Sure.
Was it steroids? No. Could it have been other types of medications? The answer is possibly yes.
With regards to the anti-aging thing, this it's not a big thing over here, but over there's a lot of anti-aging clinics, and there's been talk about fighters using that. Is that a whole separate can of worms, and what people can get from there and how they can get it, and whether it's prescribed or can you get TUEs to attend these places, or is it a massive issue that fighters can get to these places?
I don't think that anybody, the percentage of people that should ever get a therapeutic use exemption or TUE for testosterone that truly have hypogonadism would be a fraction of 1%. So when they were handing them out like candy on Halloween in the UFC back in the day, this was complete nonsense. So do I think that it's easy now to get a TUE for EPO or growth hormone or testosterone? I don't think so. Do they get them? Depends. There's different standards, with different organizations. So back to to the issue of of, who's to blame for the rampant use of drugs in sport. I believe that it starts at the very top, and that the IOC, even above them, the NBC or the television networks, that the IOC, that in track and field, the IAAF, and on down the line, that the athletes are actually victims, in my opinion, of a corrupt system. And there is a use or lose mentality. So if you have the knowledge, you've been, I tell this in my book manuscript that never came out, the Fat Boy story, which was about Greg Trafallis, who was a kid in junior high school who weighed 350 pounds. The coach said, you could probably throw the shot put. And he became one of the best in junior high, got in high school. He was one of the best in the state. He got into junior college. He was one of the best in the nation, but he was throwing like 64 feet. He gets a scholarship to go to a university in the state of Oregon. He's there, and during the Christmas break, right before, the coach of the college says, I know your goal is to go to the Olympic Games. You got to be thrown over 70 feet to do that. You're never going to be able to throw that far unless you use some sort of a performance-enhancing substance. You see these little blue pills? I think this is what you need to take. Now, that's just one example of an athlete who puts a decade of hard work into trying to get to the Olympics or become a professional baseball or football or whatever it may be. And they learn by a coach, a nutritionist, somewhere along the line, a trainer, that this is what they're doing to throw 70 feet instead of 64. Your decision is do what you got to do in order to be competitive, or change and become a doctor, a lawyer, a gardener, a plumber, a carpenter, something else. But my experience is that 80% of the time, the athletes make the decision to do what they have to do in order to be competitive because they just don't want to give up their dreams. And is there a price that a lot of them pay for that decision? Yes. My reasoning, in part, which I didn't tell you, why I made that decision to go down the slippery slope, is when I met this Olympic official, track and field official, right after the '88 Olympics, and I started working with some of his athletes. He had a high jumper and some others. And at the '92 trials, in track and field trials in New Orleans that year, I was continued to work with Greg Trafallis, and he had made the '88 Olympic team, but he came in fourth. And then a few days after the trials, and I was there with this gentleman who I think he's still alive, but he's got to be in his late 80s by this point. But he was in charge of the entire stadium in Los Angeles in '84, in Seoul in '88, and in New Orleans in '92. I was riding around in his little golf cart with him the whole time, okay? And he's saying, change the hurdles from this distance to this distance, change the long jump to the triple jump board. He was in charge of what they called implements. That means all the equipment involved in the stadium. He was like the orchestra conductor. So he was a very high-profile guy, right? He calls me and says, Victor, your boy Greg tested positive. So what do you mean? He said, well, he tested positive for Dianabol. So, oh, boy. So I get off. I call Greg. I say, Greg, were you taking Dianabol? He admits that he was. He said he tapered the normal number of days. A few days later, I get a call back from this official, and he said, tell your boy he's off the hook. So what do you mean he's off the hook? And he said, well, one of the elder statesmen at USATF, at that time it was called TAC, the Athletic Congress, this in 1992. And he said, 5 of these elder statesmen got together at a reception after the funeral for one of the executives there, and they decided that it was just not a good time to have these positive drug tests come out, and they're all going to be swept under the rug. So he told me that one of them was a 400-meter hurdler. I think it's likely somebody who went on to win Olympic gold and set a world record. And the other one was a high jumper. And I don't know who the others were, but one of them was my guy, was Greg Trafallis. So once you have this knowledge that you were being told by somebody very credible that there was 3 more positive drug tests in '88 and 5 more positive drug tests at the Olympic trials in '92, I had this information from '92 all the way for 8 years until 2000, when I got the clear and originally from Patrick, and I made that decision. If you can't beat them, possibly join them. And my thinking was all along that, you know what, this all needs to become public knowledge. So I'll join the culture. I'll do what we do on the dark side. And if it comes down that there's a big consequence, then I will tell the truth. And if we go to court, I will subpoena this gentleman who I knew to be a very honorable guy, Asian guy, that would come in and testify and tell the truth. And then we would know, the world would learn about what really goes on at the elite level of sport, and specifically Olympic sport.
Hey, let me ask you this. So Margaret's old editor at Ring Magazine, Nigel Collins, has said to me in the past, like, why do we bother? Should we just make it all legal?
Oh, the answer to that is no. You need the testing, and here's why. If you don't have testing, imagine if you could use all the testosterone that you wanted, okay? And secondly, when you use an injectable form, and because now what they're doing is they use creams and gels and orals, and if you can keep your level up way, say 4 times normal, like this, 24 hours a day, compared to microdosing small amounts at night, and it goes up like this and down like this. So as an example, let's take professional baseball. Their rules are created to enable the athletes to use drugs. Let me give you an example. They can only test them at the ballpark. They can't test them at the hotel. They can't test them at home, okay? So they play the game, they finish, they rub a testosterone cream on their arm, their levels go up like this and go down like this. So 8 hours level, they're back down below the 4-to-1 TE ratio, and they show up the next day for the game. Now, they're not able to keep their levels like this, but they are able to gain a competitive edge. So I would say that the benefits today with Vada testing may be 25% of what they would be if they had no testing. So they've definitely having these thresholds and keeping everybody flying under the radar is definitely reducing the power and speed compared to all out, use all the drugs you like. And, this whole concept and your book about CTE and how prevalent this is, and back to your original question about should they be allowed to use electrolytes, imagine with the analogy that I drew, if they weren't carb loading and sodium loading and taking these electrolytes and doing things to help them retain water during a fight, there's more damage to that brain because it's floating around in there in fluid, as you know. So all of these things are necessary if the reason they do the testing is truly to protect the health and safety of the athletes. And I know that that's what Margaret Goodman's trying to do.
Hey, I've recently read Game of Shadows. I've obviously seen the story on Netflix. I've done some homework over the last few months. Has there been an accurate depiction of you, or do you think a lot of these things are hatchet jobs?
Hatchet jobs all the way. I mean, when this Game
You've
of
got to say that,
Shadows,
but yeah, go on.
there are so many lies in that book. It's pathetic. It really is. If you go through and you look and they reference everything, and you go to those references and you follow up on those, they're just fabrication. They're making this stuff up. It amazes me that became like a best-selling book, and it's strictly a hatchet job on me and Barry Bonds. And let me give you another example of how crooked these guys really are, okay? Jeff Nowitzki in the Netflix movie, he takes 3 documents, and they put him on camera, and he says, here's this ledger, and here's this calendar, and here's this lab report. And these 3 documents, quote, prove beyond a doubt that Barry Bonds used anabolic steroids, right? Here's the facts. In 2008, there was an article published in the New York Times by Mike Schmidt, the other guy that was a commentator in the Netflix film, right? And what happened was that the prosecutors decided that all these lab reports and all this information needed to become public. And why did it become public? Well, it wasn't Barry Bonds' side, it was the government's side. Now, what Judge Ilston, the Balco judge, decided and ruled was that those 3 reports were inadmissible in a court of law. And the reason was because 1, there was no chain of custody, and 2, there was nobody to authenticate the reports. So Greg Anderson or nobody else, nobody testified. So she tossed these. So this evidence was thrown out of the court. Now, why does Jeff Novitzky basically commit fraud and go on Netflix and say these three reports are beyond a doubt proof that Barry Bonds used steroids, but he forgets to tell you that they weren't admissible in a court of law and they were tossed. So what standard do we have here? Somebody getting to say whatever he wants to say on Netflix? My opinion of Netflix, they're not very good investigative journalists that produced that movie.
Were you disappointed? Because obviously you showed some trust in them by welcoming them and welcoming them in.
I was so disappointed in the beginning that I refused to cooperate with them in the promotion of the book. And the reason was the title they selected, Hall of Shame. As soon as I heard that, well, that blankets every athlete that had ever had anything to do with me for the entire history. And from 84 till 2000, for 16 years, I never gave anybody anything. So if you come to Snack at some time soon, you'll see it's like a Hall of Fame here. We've got jerseys and balls and bats and pictures and all kind of memorabilia all over the entire building. So I didn't like it. Okay. Now, the opposite side of that is, if you notice in the film, they're showing all my products. They're showing pictures of the products and all this. So in the movie first week, there was 3 million views and it made the top 10. The second week, 5 million views. It's in the top 5. The third week, 10 million views, the #1 documentary film on all Netflix. That month, after the film came out, 100,000 new visitors came to my website. My guess is on average in the last year since that movie came out, I've made an extra 50,000 plus a month. So I like that part of it. Okay. It was a benefit, but I don't like the fact that they were promoting lies in the film.
What's the worst thing that you've read about yourself? Is there anything that really stands out?
Yeah, the part that suggests that I didn't care about the athletes. When all the athletes, and that's what they depicted in the Game of Shadows. Oh, this guy's dangerous. Oh, this guy's reckless. Oh, this guy, blah, blah, blah. Because I had a clinical laboratory and everybody, they called it Victor's short leash, meant when I gave them the clear and the cream, it was in a 1-month supply. And the protocol was on Monday and Wednesday, you take the clear. On Tuesday and Thursday, the masking agent, you take the cream. And Thursday and Friday and Saturday and Sunday, you're off. Now, the reason was because I was monitoring their blood and looking at liver enzymes and cholesterol fractions and all these other to make sure and adjusting dosages if there was anything becoming elevated. So I understood that their blood was on my hands if there was any problem developed. So I was doing this testing because I realized that they had went from buy the drugs from dark alleys behind gyms and not even understanding what they were doing regarding dosage to being in a clinical laboratory environment where we were doing testing to try to protect their health and safety. So it's that message that Jeff Novitzky gave, like anybody that had anything to do with him, oh my God, that guy's a snake oil salesman, that guy's dangerous, that guy's crazy, all this sort of stuff, when he knows damn good and well that it's simply not true. So he tried to portray himself as this guy that loves sport and the innocent guy, and oh my God, he lies in all the falsified information in the search warrants and the memorandums of interview and the memorandums of activity. He makes shit up. He just lies. So who's controlling him? And he spends $70 million on what? What did he get? I'm the so-called heavy in the case. 40 of 42 charges are dropped. I don't testify against anybody, and I go to a prison camp for 4 months where they're smoking weed and taking steroids and having sex with the female correction officers. What did he really accomplish with that $70 million? Bring about an awareness? That part's good. I'm glad. But the way he did it, and I said this in an article, an interview in the New York Times. I said, what you have is one group of cheaters, the prosecutors and the investigators, the U.S. attorneys, chasing another group of cheaters. But they're cheating. They're using the equivalent of the clear and the cream by telling lies and falsifying reports to catch the cheaters. So their mentality is whatever it takes to get the bad guy. If that means plant evidence in his car, then that's what they do. And it's sad, but that's the culture that we live in. And I'm not saying all law enforcement is corrupt and doing bad things, but definitely in the case of Balco, there's so many instances where they falsified information in the reports, and some of the other even officers themselves in the narcotic task force department told the New York Times that Jeff Nowitzki had falsified information in the original search warrant. So it's not just me saying this, it's other police officers.
Well, I was going to ask you how bad prison was, and it didn't sound too bad. I've heard different. I heard it was a pretty. You were a bit apprehensive at the start, but then my overall question is: did you get off lightly? Should you have done more time
No, if you
based on the
want,
impact? I mean, you're you've created such a character and such a you're such an important part of modern sporting history. Do you think that you deserve more than 4 months inside, or do you think that's just the technique? It was what
listen,
it was.
I knew the entire time that the laws were soft and that it was all about corruption. So I made a decision to be a part of it, but all I can say is they presented this as here's this Frankenstein, here's this, Saddam Hussein of sport. One they called me the Adolf Hitler of sport, who was attempting to create a new race of athletes. I mean, all this and crazy stuff, right? But this was the culture. This is what the overwhelming majority were doing. So my thinking was once something happens, this will create an opportunity to change that culture. Now, you see, by being an outspoken anti-doping advocate, I've tried to expose this stuff. I'm telling you the truth about these athletes and these trainers and the who's doing what. And if you notice, the only two that came and sued me were Marion Jones for 25 million and Shane Mosley for 12 million. Well, I'm 2-0 with two knockouts. Okay, they both presented fraudulent lawsuits and they both were dismissed. So any of the others that I'm talking about thus far, if they want to bring something against me, the truth is a defense in and of itself. So that's why I'm so outspoken about this stuff. It's because I know what the truth is, and I'm trying to educate the world. And I have a passion for boxing because I realize that the knowledge that I have and the impact word that you use that I could possibly have is more important in boxing and MMA than it is, like you said, in an athlete that's running faster than the guy in the lane next to him. That's not an objective of bodily harm and brain damage. That's what boxers try to do. So what I'm doing is, and have sponsored many fighters that have been with Snack, is to protect my fighters from what the other guy's doing. I know my guy's clean, but I'm trying to protect him from brain damage caused by the other guy being on PEDs.
We started before we were on camera. We were talking about running and sprints and stuff, and what good is it to run long distances for boxing? Because I suppose because this goes back to a conversation I had with Mickey Ward many years ago, and I said to him, "What running do you do?" And he says, "I do sprints and hill sprints." And he doesn't do long runs because he says, "I don't fight at one pace. I've got to pick it up and change and
Well,
affirm my
there you
combination."
go. That's what I've been saying all along. And you have fighters, and I'll give you a specific example. Virgil Ortiz. I saw, and I worked with him in his last fight, but I saw him in an interview where he said that every single day he wakes up and he runs 5 miles or about an hour. I said, holy smokes, this kid's not going to last very long at all. He should not be doing this. You have this rhabdo, disorder. He got it 3 fights in a row and it was canceled because they did not understand that the training was causing this condition. There's even something called foot strike hemolysis. That means the older and more fragile red blood cells, when you're running and you're pounding your feet on the ground, they're breaking down. And at a certain point, you end up with blood in your urine. So he had this dark urine. So the last fight, what I got them to do was eliminate 3 of these days and do high oxygen with a mask, an oxy mask, on a stationary bike for 1 hour and replace that running. And that alone, he felt so much more energy, and it helped him. And he was able to at least fight after canceling 3 fights in a row. So, what I'm saying is, overtraining is very common. When you do long distance running, it lowers your testosterone. Look at a marathon runner with 9-inch arms. Look at a cyclist with 9-inch arms. Well, the reason is they're developing slow twitch muscle fiber and not fast twitch. Fast twitch comes from sprinting, from explosive type training, and then you accelerate the production of lactic acid more quickly. And then this increases testosterone and growth hormone production, and ultimately the development of type 2B fast twitch muscle fiber, which makes you gain muscle mass and increases speed and power. Long distance running. Now, we do other types of sprint interval training that I believe is more effective than long distance running. And we do all sorts of, we use low oxygen. We use high oxygen for recovery. So we do what I call, OMT, oxygen modulation training. So we incorporate, we wear masks, different type of masks for high oxygen compared to low oxygen. This is what I would like to show you. I have 32 machines in this building that are either oxygen concentrators or hypoxicators that generate high oxygen or low oxygen. And I've developed protocols. So they do this as an example before they spar. They will sit while they're getting their hands wrapped and be breathing 2 oxygen concentrators, generating close to 100% oxygen, wide together. So you have a 20 liter per minute flow rate through an open design mask, so that they're breathing in the high oxygen at about 68%, and they're exhaling or flushing their system of carbon dioxide, ammonia, lactic acid, of these metabolic toxins. So we super oxygenate them before they spar and before they train.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So here's the thing with boxing. Okay, is unlike a lot of the other stuff, whether it's track and field, or long distance, short distance, jumping, whatever it is, boxers need a lot of help, don't they? Because they do want to get stronger, fitter, faster, but they also we mentioned diuretics in the sense that they need to lose weight. Some of them want stimulants as a pick-me-up way, maybe for a fight or even for training. Then you've got other people looking to take stuff to move up in weight and move up through the weights, or maybe take that big jump from cruiserweight to heavyweight. And then you've got other guys that need to work on their engine. So, like, it's a really complex itinerary of stuff that boxers would need to improve, isn't it? More so, arguably more so than most other sports.
Absolutely. And let me say this. The type of training that we do with Remy Korchemny on a track, it's not track training. He has described this as closer to tennis training, because a boxer only takes a few steps forward and backward and side to side. He's either looking for opportunities to throw punches and sees openings, or he sees something coming and to get out of the way as quickly as he can. So it's called reversibility of effort, which means we use these very powerful 40-foot, which we in half, that's 20 feet of these bands with shoulder and waist straps, and they come out 5 or 6 steps and throw punches. Then the like a slingshot, it's pulling you backwards very powerfully, right? Then before the tension in the band drops, we have them explode in the opposite direction. So we do lateral or shuffle side to side. We do back pedal. So all this is movement forward, backward, side to side. That's what boxers do. Nowhere in boxing do they go tempo for an hour. Makes no sense. They're developing slow twitch muscle fiber. So the training that we do is very specific to boxing. And if you ask Remy, he said that most of the boxing trainers that he talks to, if you ask them why you do the exercise that you do, most of the time they can't tell you. You ask him, he'll tell you exactly why you're doing what you're doing and how it applies to boxing.
Well,
So we have a completely different approach here than traditional boxing.
boxing was very slow to adopt S&C, wasn't it? And I remember speaking to Harold Johnson, the great light heavyweight from Philadelphia back in the day, who was a fighter in the 50s and 60s. And I asked him if he weight trained, and he was so insulted because he had a chiseled physique, and he was insulted. He's like, no, I wouldn't have done anything like that. As in, like, I'm an old school fighter. We fight, and I didn't do that because it makes you slow and bulky, and that was
No,
the
that's
thing, wasn't it?
it's absolutely not true. That's just all misinformation. It's because when you ask a boxing trainer where they learned what they learned, well, my uncle or my cousin or my father, or it came down, and this misinformation gets handed down from generation to generation. The new training includes all sorts of things that old school boxing does not. So, do sprinters do weight training? Of course they do. They become the fastest humans in the world. Do you think they got there by running long distance? So, does a boxer need speed? Does a boxer need power? Does a boxer need agility? Does a boxer go forward, backward, and side to side? Do you need to increase the speed and power of a boxer? Yes. You don't do that. You do that. Plyometrics is very important, the jumping aspect. Let me tell you what we do instead of the plyometrics box jumping. All right. We have a horizontal plyometrics machine that's got an incline of 4%. So they lay down, it has a space-aged footboard to protect their knees and their ankles, etc. And then they jump, and only laying down. And these have very powerful, up to 650 pounds of pressure using rubber bands. Okay, so they're not jumping up and down. And what happens is when you use bands as opposed to free weights, the higher you go, the more tension there is. So at this height, it might be 150 pounds. At this height, it might be 200 pounds of tension. And then, of course, we do one leg, we do two legs. There's periodization, different times within training. We do low oxygen at the beginning, we do high oxygen at the end, and this is like what they call resistance and assistance training. In lay terms, that means running with the wind behind you or running with the wind in your face, running uphill or running downhill. Makes sense? So when you're running downhill, you can run faster than you can when you're running on a flat ground or uphill. So this we take when we give people 100% oxygen when they're on a non-motorized treadmill, their top end speed and their power output is about 10% greater. So the number of punches that they can throw in a minute when they're breathing 100% oxygen compared to 20% ambient sea level. So their system, the neurological firing system, learns how to do things that they can't do without the assistance. But you have what they call memory effect, like with muscle training. Once you've done this training of running downhill, and Remy created a track at Merritt College in Oakland with a 5% decline or incline. So what happened was he would train this guy to start, and he's on a Mondo track, just like they have in an Olympic Stadium, only he's running downhill. Well, later in the season, he had this kid for 2 seasons. He ran the national record of 993, shattered it of 997, the fastest junior college athlete in the history of the sport. Okay, because he trained with assistance by running and sprinting downhill. So did that transfer to when he ran on flat ground? It certainly did, and he became the fastest sprinter in the history of junior college.
So if I come to Snack, can I try some of this stuff?
Sure, you can do it all. We'll have you do everything. Listen, let me tell you some of the other stuff we do. If they're breathing low oxygen on a non-motorized treadmill, and they have a certain type of mask, and they're breathing 14% instead of 20%. So it's like high elevation. So they ramp up for 9 seconds, do all out sprints for 6 seconds, and they jump off. They wait 45 seconds, they do another rep. They do 5 reps. In between, we take that mask off. They go into another chamber with a Wingate bike that's got 60% oxygen. So for recovery between sets, you get in there and you bring your heart rate up to maybe 100, where they're coming from 180 over here with a 1 rep max. And for 5 minutes, they're breathing this oxygen. The reason we don't have them sit there is because if your normal heart rate's 50 and we bring it up to 100, you increase what they call the stroke volume, or the amount of blood that is fully oxygenated, because now you're breathing 60% oxygen instead of 20. So you do this for 5 minutes, you come out. We oftentimes, from that super oxygenation, their power and their speed, the next 5 reps is greater than the first. So do you understand what I'm saying? We're doing things that enable you to perform at a level that is superhuman for you. It's faster, it's stronger than you can do normally, but the adaptive mechanisms kick in and you learn how to go there. And does this all transfer to in the boxing ring? Do they perform better in the later rounds if we super oxygenate them before the sparring starts? We think we do.
Do you think fighters who failed tests should be in the Hall of Fame? More and more fighters are going in the Hall of Fame. It
Fighters
does
who
seem to be a
fail
debate.
tests should receive a consequence. In boxing, I would like to see it. And as you know, now in Olympic sport, it's a 4-year penalty. In boxing, there needs to be at least a 2-year penalty. So we see Andre Berto get 3 months. We see Canelo get 6 months. We see Ryan Garcia get 1 year. PBC fighters fight on average every 14 months anyway. So what is this? Oh, big penalty for Ryan Garcia, 1 year. So what Devin just offered him yesterday publicly online, his dad, was let's start testing today and test for 6 months, because they're planning a rematch. And my opinion is that's because Turkey is saying, we don't want to have risk of you guys fighting before then, and I'm willing to sponsor a rematch right after Ryan Garcia's suspension is over. So why not go into testing now? Right? So Margaret's agreed to do this. We communicated with her. Let's see if Ryan Garcia, his only choice to get Turkey involved with the promotion and a big fight, and with Devin Haney, is going to be wherever it is. They're talking about Las Vegas, but why would he not? If they're going to sign for big money now and Turkey is going to be behind this, why would he not be willing to do testing unless he's using drugs?
Do you think you'll be able to do enough good in the sport to get into the Hall of Fame or any of the sports Hall of Fames?
I think that Balco and that history will be with me for the rest of my life. And I believe in second chances. And I believe that I am a role model for younger people who make serious mistakes, that your life is not over, that you can come back and you can be all that you were meant to be. So I have a pretty ugly and a decade of headlines calling me all sorts of bad names, but I don't let that affect my opinion of myself. So am I glad that I have been able to help 31 world champions and do what I can to participate and be a part of the anti-doping movement that exists in boxing? Yes. So do I think that I will ever be recognized for what I've done? Maybe not.
Last couple, let's time together. Is your reputation important to you, and are you misunderstood now?
I'm greatly misunderstood. But remember the Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, speak your mind in strong terms today, though it may contradict everything you said yesterday. So you'll be misunderstood. To be great is to be misunderstood. Look at Socrates, look at Jesus, look at Confucius. I have always wanted to be great at music, at now the opportunity to not as an athlete, but to be a participant and a part of a team. People ask me every day, they're confused. I get put into that strength and conditioning coach. I've never been somebody to count the push-ups or the squats or what the people do in the gym. I consider myself a project team leader. With every boxer that I work with, most of them have a different trainer or a different strength and conditioning guy, but I do what I do. I have my lane. Generally, we work under my terms, which means they don't pay me, and in return, they help me promote snack. That's how it works. And so I'm proud of this facility and all of these methods that I've developed. And for people that thought years ago that all he did was give people drugs, I think now with this 21-year history of being participating at the elite level of sport in boxing, uh, without and being clean. Hopefully, one day people will acknowledge that.
Hey, there was one more actually. I skipped it. It's not trying to be. Who is Evan Fields?
Who is what?
Evan Fields.
I don't know who Evan Fields is.
Was it there was a name, and I think people thought it was a heavyweight boxer linked to the Balco thing, linked to the Balco scandal, should we say?
There's no heavyweight that I know of. The only one that was linked was Shane Mosley.
Okay. And in terms of Victor, where you're at now, are you satisfied with your journey, the fact that come full circle and that you've learned from the mistakes and everything else? Do you feel good, or do you still feel remorse about back in those days, or are you through that phase?
I will always have regrets about the damage that I did, not only to my family, but to the athletes that I worked with, because I was the leader. They were following me. I was doing things that were wrong, that were illegal, and that were against the rules. And I made that decision to join that culture. And it was a reckless decision because I see what happens to not only the athletes, but their kids that see that their parents, their dads, were involved in this activity. So just because the overwhelming majority were doing it doesn't make it right for me to join that culture. I was still breaking the rules. So I always have regrets about the damage that I did to other people. I accepted full consequences. I didn't tell on anybody. I got the sentence that I got for the crimes that I committed. I went to prison. I got out. I've tried to rebuild my life. I'm basically doing what I was doing back then, only without the drugs now. I'm still working with athletes. I was doing all sorts of things in addition to giving them drugs then. Obviously, the drug program that I developed were very effective because of all of the world records and Olympic gold medalists and all the many athletic achievements that were accomplished. And I do believe, like Charlie Francis once said, there's a level playing field. It's just not the one everyone thought it was. So do I believe that using drugs is rampant? Yes. Do I believe that it's right? No.
Victor, this has been fabulous. I really hope that before the end of the year I can come out and see you at Snack and spend some time with you. But thank you so much for being so
We would
great for
love to
this.
have you. We would love to have you anytime. And congratulations to you. I haven't read your new book yet, but as I told you, I ordered it from Amazon and I really look forward to it. I think it's going to be at my house when I get home. And then after I read it, I'll let you know. But your whole focus, I know, on CTE and boxing is so important. And the initial questions, dehydration and understanding that should they be allowed to take to sodium load and carb load and have Gatorade, as long as it's sealed in a container when it goes into the locker room, then yes, why not? If why do they have to drink only water? Water, when they're sweating, it's not just water, it's electrolytes. So why should they not be allowed to put those back before a fight as a protective measure against potential brain damage?
Yeah, definitely. Well, Victor, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much for making the time. I'm really grateful, and it's been fabulous. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much, Tris.
Okay, keep in touch. All right, bye-bye. Bye.